Welcome, Rik Palieri, to the show now known as PVC NYC TV, for lack of a better name. It's our interview show talking to folks who are going to be performing at the People's Voice Cafe. And you have a show coming up on November 11th, 2023, with George Mann, and we're very excited. I'm certainly excited to come and hear you and see you. So, I'm Chris Old Dude Owens. I'm a singer-songwriter as well, working with the PVC. I'm also a member of the People's Music Network, and I love getting to know folks. So this is a fun experiment for me. We're doing this for the first time this year, and hopefully it'll catch on, and we'll be able to keep it going. So let me start by asking you, a real basic question. Where were you born? Where were you raised? How'd you get involved with music? What turned you on?
Well, I'll tell you, Chris, that it all started out, living in New Jersey. Okay, I was born in New Jersey and came from working class family. My mother originally from Poland, my father part Polish and part Italian. And so I grew up around a lot of storytelling. My mom loved to tell stories. She just passed away a couple weeks ago. She would sit around the table and spin stories that I'd love to hear over and over again about her childhood living in Poland and other things about the family. And I think it was that kind of interest in history that probably was the beginning of my journey. I listened to a lot of music. She loved music. She would play a lot of Ray Charles and Harry Belafonte, and of course my father would listen to the Italian singers, the Dean Martins, and all of that. And my grandmother, his mom, loved country western music. So I would listen to a lot of country western music when I was young, listening to Johnny Cash and Hank Williams and all of that. But it wasn't really until I got the idea of playing the banjo. Chris, it was a weird thing that happened. I was in high school carrying around equipment for a rock and roll band.
Wait, what high school did you go to?
East Brunswick High School.
East Brunswick, okay, cool.
And so I was, basically a roadie, and I was watching all these guys play electric guitars. And at that moment, I started hearing the sound of a banjo in my ear. I don't know exactly. I mean, I had seen Foggy Mountain Breakdown, in Bonnie and Clyde, and of course, had the Beverly Hillbillies and stuff. But, it was that sound that started going into my head. And I started thinking about the idea of playing the banjo. And I got a Pete Seeger book before I actually got my banjo. And I was reading Pete's book all the time and practicing on my pillow. practice the finger motions on my pillow. And it was that Pete, I started seeing him on Sesame Street. He would be popping up on Sesame Street. And then he came to Douglas College. I was still in high school. And I skipped out of school that day, as one does on an important occasion like this. And my hair was really long back then. And so I was able to slip in the back of the college there without anybody really noticing. And there was Pete on stage. And there was something that happened, Chris. It was one of those moments that it's hard to define. But Pete was up on stage and he was singing, and he had the whole room singing. And I felt my body fill up with light. And I felt like I had a purpose for the first time, that I wanted to do this. I wanted to live this kind of life of of getting people to sing along. And after the show, I went backstage, and there was Pete and Toshi, and they were surrounded by all kinds of students and mothers with children and stuff. And I went over and I asked them a question, and I said, "Mr. Seeger, why do you play the banjo?" And he smiled at me and goes, "Because I like the tone." And so that was my first interaction with Pete. And it really did. It lit this fire inside of me. And I joined up with the Clearwater.
Okay.
And then I started seeing Pete on I'd see him from afar, but I was very shy, so I wasn't really going over and trying to talk with him or anything. And I was still playing my banjo and trying to play the banjo. And then what happened was that Pete was going to play a concert in Central Park with Arlo Guthrie.
Mm-hmm.
And my younger sister, Lisa, 11 years younger, she used to see Pete on Sesame Street. And the deal was anytime that Pete was on Sesame Street, she would tell me. So I would go over and watch Pete, And so I said, well, I'm going to go to that concert, And she heard me. She heard me say that. And the next day, the day of the concert, she went with my mother and my other sister, Tina, and they went to to go look at museums. And they saw everybody setting up all these blankets all over Central Park. And my sister said, "What's going on?" "Oh, Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie are having a concert tonight." Well, Lisa got the idea that with, all the records that were in the house and my interest in Pete, that I must be good buds with Pete. And she just thought I just might be backstage with him. So she went over and got my sister, Tina, and they went over to the guard. And they said, "My brother's backstage with Pete Seeger. I need you to take me to him." And he did. So the guy brought Tina and Lisa backstage and met with Pete and Toshi. And they had this meeting that I had no idea that this was going on. So whatever happened was kind of just a magical moment, because that night, I did go to the concert, and I was sitting there, and Pete says, "Well, tomorrow there's a big concert in Hoboken, New Jersey. Benefit for the Clearwater. Everybody's invited." So I was all excited, Chris. And, I said, "No, I'm going to get up in the morning. I'm going to go out there to Hoboken." Well, I get up in the morning and I have my banjo on my back. I'm in the kitchen. I'm walking out the door. And Lisa said, "Did you know that Pete Seeger files his nails?" I said, I didn't really even question. I just kind of just walked out the door. So I get over to Hoboken, and I get there, and there's just a few young people like myself. We all have some instruments, and we're sort of playing over near the stage, and like you would at a Clearwater kind of a.
Sure, of course.
And Pete comes over, takes out his big 12-string guitar, and he starts playing along, and I'm 19 years old, Chris. So I'm like, I can't believe that this is happening to me. I'm like, what is this anyway? And so the music stops, and Pete looks at me and he goes, "I haven't seen you before. Who are you?" And I got really panicky. I was like, "My name's Rik Palieri." And he smiles. He goes, "Rick, I met your sisters yesterday." I'm like, "What?" "I met your sisters yesterday. They told me that you were a good banjo player. Why don't you come up on the stage and we'll play?"
Oh my God.
So Pete brings me up on the stage in the show. We play Cripple Creek and Old Joe Clark, just two banjos up on stage. And we're playing the banjos. And that was the beginning. That was the real beginning of my life, because my life after that moment, Chris, it was never the same. Sure. It was never the same.
Sure.
What happened is, photographer took a picture that went into the Asbury Park Press. The newspaper called me up. They did an interview, blah, blah, blah. And then ever since then, and then Pete started calling me up. He would call me up and say, "Rick, we need young people to get involved with the Clearwater. Why don't you think about starting a little sloop club over in your part of New Jersey?" And so I did. and organized a festival because one day, you know how it is, Chris, you couldn't say no to Pete.
Of course not.
Pete would call you up. And first of all, you know, Toshi would be in the background. You'd hear her because Pete would be talking and he'd go, well, Rick, did I ever tell you about the history of the American labor movement? and Toshi would go, Peter, who's paying for that call? And he said, oh, I'm sorry, Rick. You know, you would never hang up on Pete, you know, and he would just go on and on and on. And it was just wonderful. It was magic. Every time that he would call, it was magic. But, you know, at the same time, it was costing a fortune. And so he got me to organize a festival in New Jersey, in Perth Amboy. And he couldn't make it that first year, but we were able to get Harry Chapin and Bob McGrath from Sesame Street. And I invited all the local musicians to come, and, you know, the Clearwater was there. And then the next year, Pete came, and there were 5,000 people there. And I ran that festival called the Festival of Blueberries for many years. And then started another festival in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And so, you know, I was, you know, starting to work with the community and make all of these different types of festivals. And you know, playing in schools and things like that, and hitchhiking around the country and doing school programs, and one thing leads to another. And here it is 50 years later from when I started. And and you look back on that. You know, now here's a cool thing, Chris, is that it all started because I went to that show at Douglas College at the chapel. And just recently, it was just a few months back, I got awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award from the New Jersey Folk Festival. And we were right there at Douglas College within earshot of that original experience. There was the chapel where Pete first sang. And I was thinking back to that time. And so I was at the festival, I sang Jacob's Ladder because I think that Pete had sung it that night, you know. And it's been a really interesting experience because for about 40 years, Pete was involved in my life. In the beginning, in small ways, you know, that would be singing with the sloop. You know, I was part of the Hudson River Sloop Singers. Right. So we would sing on the pumpkin sail. We would do all of that type of thing. And then back in 1999, I started a television show called the Songwriter's Notebook, which in many ways was like Pete's Rainbow Quest, where I would invite different musicians and interview them. And I had a dream list of different people that I wanted to have on. And of course, Pete was on there. And Pete said yes. And so I went over to Beacon and brought a little crew with me. And I sat down with all these questions. And Pete looked at the question. He said, Rick, this looks like it would take a week to answer all these questions. But we've got an hour, so let's start right now. And so that was the first time that I interviewed him. And that interview became the beginning of what is now my collection at the American Folklife Center and the Library of Congress. So I've interviewed Pete extensively, 5 or 6 hours of recordings on every topic that you can think of. You know, we started with his early years, and then we went in and we did a thing on the Music for Peace, because I was involved with a book project. So that's the other thing. I did not anticipate doing these types of things. Okay, right. I didn't plan on being an organizer, or I didn't plan on being a TV producer and host, or radio, or a writer.
Right.
But I have a book that is a new book based on an older book that I had written. But this book is called Banjo Man: Adventures of an American Folk Singer, and it's 530 some odd pages. And my friend Mark Ross for the Rose Tattoo said, Rick, most people, they write a book you can't put down. You wrote one that you can't pick up. It's so fat. And it has all the stories about the travels throughout the world. Because I've played in many different countries. I have played in Israel. I played at the Jacob's Ladder Festival. So I have a lot of friends over there right now. And in Poland, and I lived in Poland for a while, and Argentina and Australia and all kinds of places. And my music became a passport that enabled me to travel and meet with people, and it really has changed my life in so many ways, and brought all of these people to interact with and learn from, mentors like Utah Phillips. I was part of the Rose Tattoo when Utah was around, and we would go and do shows together and hang out together. My first mentor, before I even met Pete, was Sis Cunningham. Sis Cunningham from Broadside Magazine, being an original almanac singer. And then, of course, Pete, and then Utah, and then a strange character out in the Ozarks named Jimmy Driftwood, who wrote The Battle of New Orleans.
Oh, sure.
Stud, and he was another mentor. And all of these people really helped to shape my vision and what I was able to do. And you learn through that process. I mean, like now, my TV show has been going on since 1999. And there are hundreds of interviews in the Library of Congress now in my collection. And what's cool about it, Chris, is when somebody's doing research, I get a call from the Library of Congress, and I get to talk with the people, and they get to ask me questions about what they're researching. And so you're able to contribute. I think that's the important thing. Is in the beginning, you're doing something for yourself, and then, as a songwriter, you know what I'm talking about. You're writing songs and you're starting to play and so forth. And then something else comes into question about, okay, so what do you have to offer? What can you contribute? Sure. How can you make what you have into something that will benefit more than just yourself?
Let me interrupt you on that point right there, because the process of getting to that point obviously is one that involved many, many songs having been written, right? The experience of writing the song, the experience of collaborating with other musicians, the experience of performing, all contributes to the honing of your sense of self and the sense of the role you're going to have moving forward. For you, you started off by saying that your mother was a storyteller and that you loved sitting and listening to her stories. What is it that works for you in terms of the process of creating that song? Do you hear the story first? Do you just have a concept? Do you have a melody in mind? How does the idea of I'm taking this thought and turning it into this impactful thing, how does that work for you? Because everybody seems to be a little bit different.
Yeah, I think it does. In the beginning, it's almost like a fun little challenge that you do with a friend, where when you're first starting to write songs, you're sitting with a friend and you're kind of spinning ideas off of each other, and then you have to. For me, I have to have something to say. Okay, what am I going to say? What story am I going to tell, and why? And is it a fun song? Is it just for fun? Is it a teaching song? Is it something that you're trying to tell someone else's story? I think one of the most unusual songs that I put together has a crazy story behind it. So I got to be friends with a lot of the old hobos. Okay, and this was going, from Utah Phillips would tell me, he said, Rick, you should go out there and meet with some of the old timers, listen to their stories. You might write songs that you could have never written on your own. So I started going out to the hobo conventions, And I met with a lot of the kings and queens of hobos out in Britt, Iowa. And they have, it's one of the oldest conventions in this country. It's over 100 and I think I have to look it up, but it's over 100 and maybe 20 years now. It's a really,
Wow.
and all the hobos gather together in Britt, Iowa, and they sit around the campfire and tell stories together, and we sing songs together. And so one of the old hobo kings, his name was Frog. And Frog I interviewed him. I got to know him, pretty well. And I got this email. I was on tour in England about that Frog had died, or what we call in the hobo lingo, had caught the westbound. And so in honor of my friend Frog, I wrote the song about riding the westbound. So I emailed it in, and then a few days later, I got an email back, and they said, "Oh, they had a big party for Frog out in St. Paul, Minnesota, and all the old hobos were there, and they're singing songs and rejoicing over their dear fallen comrade." When right in the middle of the festivities, got a telephone call from guess who? Frog. And he's wondering why there was this big party going on and he wasn't invited. They said, "Frog, we thought you were dead." He said, "Dead? No, I was robbed." "What do you mean you were robbed?" "I was walking down the street in Boston. Somebody lifted my wallet out of my back pocket, stole my identification, and they started pretending they were me. They had traveled all over, pretending they were me. And they got on to a bus out to North Dakota and they died." Well, when the police found them, they found my stolen ID. They thought it was me. They started calling up my relatives and told them I'm dead. He said, "Well, I'm here to tell you that I ain't dead. Well, now the good thing is I know exactly what my funeral's going to be like." So I had written that song and Frog loved it. He said, "Rik, nobody can tell of my demise and resurrection like you can." And he would always request the song. What happened was Frog unfortunately did pass away, and I got a request. His last wishes was that I came back to the Brit hobo gathering where he was going to be buried in the hobo cemetery and sing for him at his gravesite as they honor him. So I went with my friend Rick Nessler. We went out to the hobo convention and we're standing there, Chris, and I looked down at the tombstone and it has my song on it.
Oh.
With my name on it.
Oh, wow.
Now, that's a weird thing to be in the cemetery looking at a gravestone, singing this song, and seeing your song on the gravestone.
With your name.
With your name. So that, and it was really interesting because, the song is one thing, but after the song, I wrote a recitation, an old style recitation, because when they start a hobo gathering, what you have to do is you have to build the fire, because that's the symbol of everybody getting together. And the fire has to continue throughout the whole thing. The fire goes out, that's not a good thing. So there's a fire attender, fire builder, who keeps the fire going. When they start that fire, they have a big ceremony. And one of the things they do is they throw in all the ashes from the different campfires where the hobos had gathered. And they also throw in the ashes of hobos who passed away. Now, the thing is that when you throw in the ashes from some of the hobos, it has the metal has an interaction with the flames, and sometimes it's colorful when you throw that in there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
As I was saying.
So you're tending the fire. The metal interacts with certain metals, create these different colors in the flames, which is kind of cool.
Right. And so what happened is that I was watching that, and this is talking about the creative process. All of a sudden, this story came to my mind. A young hobo hopped off a boxcar just outside of town. He found a quiet little jungle where he could lay his spindle down. He grabbed some dry firewood to brighten up the night. But when he struck his match, he saw an awful, eerie sight. For the campfire glowed and sparkled with a brilliant rainbow flame, flickering and dancing like the headlight of a fast westbound train. When out of the smoke and cinders and through the fiery air came the ghost of some old hobos he thought he met somewhere. They came and shook his hand, as all good hobos do, and they offered up a spud or two, and they started boiling up a stew. Their calm and friendly manner finally calmed the young beau's fright. He asked if they could jungle up together and spend the lonesome night. Each of us caught the westbound, one beau said with a tear, but we all come back to Pennsburg if only once a year. In the third week in September, when fall is almost near, we hobo out of heaven and we jungle up right here. You see, this old jungle is a mighty sacred spot where hobos gathered year after year and camped on this very lot. It was one of the best gatherings that you could ever find, where hobos were respected and treated oh so fine. Well, the moon started yawning, for it was almost dawn. The beaus made up their packs and said they'd be moving on. Then there was a mighty whistle and the campfire filled with steam, and all the hobos vanished like it was just a crazy dream. The young beau sat bewildered. He said, "How could this really be? Is it something I've been drinking? Or is my mind just fooling me?" Then he looked into the fire, and what he saw he could not explain. For there were his hobo buddies riding on a fiery train. The train sounded one last whistle, and his hobo pals waved so long. Then a magic wind blew the flames out, and the campfire light was gone. The young beau packed his bindle. He walked down to the track. He hopped inside a boxcar, but he knew that he'd be back, for the magic in Pennsburg's campfire still lives in all the hearts of every beau who went there and camped beneath the stars. And someday, in the future, when all of us are gone, a space-age traveler will light the fire, and the legend will live on.
Wow. Wow, that's really cool. Wow.
And so
thank you for sharing that.
So, and of course you can hear, that kind of style of recitation was something that the old hobos did and still do. And Utah Phillips, of course, learned a lot from that. And I learned from those guys. Everything that I do, I've been able to learn from some of my different mentors.
So basically, the inspiration for your work comes from all the interactions that you've been having throughout your life with these different characters and different forces. But from a formal training standpoint, and you taught yourself the banjo, it sounds like, mm-hmm. So you didn't really have a lot of formal training in music, is that correct?
Right. No, I learned from the people. I learned from watching Pete on stage. We'd be singing together, on a Clearwater, the Pumpkin Sale, and other places. And I'd watch what he did and learn from him that way. And or the Native American flute. You want to hear what that sounds like?
Sure, why not?
Hold on one second.
Yeah.